Hello, hey. We're back this week with the scientific revolution. I hope that you guys enjoyed your weekend and you're ready to get started. So, today, what we're going to be talking about is basically the medieval view of the scientific revolution, how it brought about a new way of thinking, essentially, what a new model of the universe looked like because of the scientific revolution, Galileo's discoveries, and the conflict that that made with the church. And then we're going to be talking a little bit about the scientific method, and we're going to talk about Newton and his laws of gravity. And then we're going to kind of talk about how the scientific revolution spread throughout Europe. So, what it influenced. So, scientific instruments and how it influenced medicine and the human body and things like that. So, without further ado, let's jump right in. Before 1500, scholars generally decided what was true or false by referring to an ancient Greek or Roman author or to the Bible. Few European scholars challenged the scientific ideas of the ancient thinkers or the church by carefully observing nature for themselves. Now, during the Middle Ages, most scholars believed that the Earth was an immovable object located at the center of the universe. According to that belief, that meant that the moon, the sun, and all of the planets moved in a perfect circular path around the Earth. Now, common sense did seem to support this view back then. After all, the sun appeared to be moving around the Earth as it rose in the morning and set in the evening. So this wasn't totally far-fetched. This Earth-centered view of the universe was called the geocentric theory. The idea came from Aristotle, the Greek philosopher of the 4th century BC. Then there was a Greek astronomer named Ptolemy who expanded the theory in the 2nd century AD. Now, in addition, Christianity taught that God had deliberately placed the earth at the center of the universe. And what this did is it basically made Earth a special place in which the great drama of life unfolded. Beginning in the mid 1500s, a few scholars published works that challenged the ideas of ancient thinkers and the church. As these scholars replaced old assumptions with new theories, they launched a change in European thought that historians now call the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution was a new way of thinking about the natural world. That was based upon, careful observation and a willingness to question accepted beliefs. So not only would you observe, but then you had to question the world around you. A combination of discoveries and circumstances led to the scientific revolution and helped spread its impact. During the Renaissance, European explorers traveled to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, and such lands were inhabited by peoples and animals that were previously unknown to Europe. These discoveries opened Europeans to the possibility that there were new truths out there to be found. I guess you could say Europeans finally realized they weren't the center of the universe. The invention of the printing press also helped spread challenging ideas, both old and new, more widely to Europe's thinkers, because with the printing press you can print things more quickly and then there's more access to books and articles and things of that nature. The age of European exploration also fueled a great deal of scientific research, especially in astronomy and mathematics. Navigators needed better instruments and geographic measurements in order to determine their location in the open sea as exploration became more of a thing. So as scientists began to look more closely at the world around them, they made observations that didn't match the ancient beliefs that they had been taught their entire lives. They found that they had reached the limit of the classical world's knowledge, and yet they still needed to know more. An early challenge to accepted scientific thinking came in the field of astronomy. It started when a small group of scholars began to question the geocentric theory. Remember, that's the theory that everything revolves around the Earth. Although that was backed by authority and common sense, the geocentric theory did not accurately explain the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets. This problem troubled a Polish cleric and astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus. In the early 1500s, Copernicus became interested in an old Greek idea that the sun actually stood at the center of the universe. Now, after studying planetary movements for more than 25 years, Copernicus reasoned that the stars, the Earth, and other planets actually revolved around the sun instead of everything revolving around the Earth. Now, Copernicus's heliocentric or sun-centered theory still did not completely explain why the planets orbited the way they did. He also knew that most scholars and clergy would reject his theory because it contradicted their religious views. Fearing ridicule and persecution, Copernicus did not publish his findings until 1543, which was actually the last year of his life. He received a copy of his book, which was called On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Bodies, actually on his deathbed. He died within days of receiving it. While revolutionary, Copernicus's book caused a little stir at first, so everyone kind of ignored it. But then, over the next century and a half, other scientists started to build on the foundations that he had laid. A Danish astronomer named Tycho Brahe carefully recorded the movements of the planets for many years. Brahe produced mountains of accurate data based on his operations. However, it was left to his followers to make mathematical sense of them because he was an astronomer, not a mathematician. After Brahe's death in 1601, his assistant, who was indeed a brilliant mathematician named Johannes Kepler, continued his work. And after studying Brahe's data, Kepler concluded that certain mathematical laws govern planetary motion. One of these laws showed that the planets revolve around the sun in elliptical orbits instead of circles, as they previously thought. Now, Kepler's laws showed that Copernicus's basic idea was true and demonstrated mathematically that the planets actually revolve around the sun. An Italian scientist named Galileo Galilei built on the new theories about astronomy. As a young man, Galileo learned that a Dutch lens maker had built an instrument that could enlarge far-off objects. So Galileo took this technology and he built himself his own telescope, and he used it to study the heavens in 1609. Then in 1610, he actually published a small book called Starry Messenger, which described his astonishing observations of the planets and the moons, etc. For example, Galileo announced that Jupiter had 4 moons, and that the sun actually had dark spots. He also noted that the Earth's moon had a rough, uneven surface, which shattered Aristotle's theory that the moon and the stars were made up of pure, perfect substance. Galileo's observations, as well as his laws of motion, also clearly supported the theories of Copernicus. Now, Galileo's findings frightened both the Catholic and the Protestant leaders because they went against the church teachings and therefore the church's authority. If people believed the church could be wrong about this, then they could be wrong about other teachings as well, which brought into doubt the authority of the church. So this was a scary moment for European churches. So in 1616, the Catholic Church warned Galileo not to defend his ideas or the ideas of Copernicus. Although Galileo remained publicly silent, he continued his studies secretly. Then, in 1632, he actually published the Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. This book presented the ideas of both Copernicus and Ptolemy, but it clearly showed that Galileo supported the Copernican theory. The Pope angrily summoned Galileo to Rome to stand trial before the Inquisition because of this book. Galileo did indeed stand trial and went before the court in 1633. And under the threat of torture and possibly death, he knelt before the cardinals and he read aloud a signed confession. In this confession, he agreed that the ideas of Copernicus and his own ideas and observations were false. And even though he did do this, Galileo was never going to be a free man again. The church actually held him under house arrest until he died in 1642 in his villa in Florence. However, his books and his ideas will still spread all over Europe. And just to put it into perspective for you, it wasn't until 1992 that the Catholic Church officially acknowledged that Galileo had been right. The revolution in scientific thinking that Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo began eventually developed into a new approach of science called the scientific theory. The scientific theory is a logical procedure for gathering and testing ideas. Many of you probably already know what this is because, well, you've been through high school and you had to do, the science fair and stuff in primary school. But just to give you a brief explanation of what the scientific theory is, it begins with a problem or a question arising from an observation. Scientists next form a hypothesis or an unproved assumption. The hypothesis is then tested in an experiment or on the basis of data. In the final step, scientists analyze and interpret their data to reach a new conclusion, and that conclusion either confirms or disproves the hypothesis. Now, the scientific method did not develop overnight. The work of two very important thinkers in the 1600s, Francis Bacon and René Descartes, helped to advance the new approach. Francis Bacon was an English statesman and writer, and he had a passionate interest in science. He believed that by better understanding the world, scientists would generate practical knowledge that would improve people's lives. In his writings, Bacon attacked medieval scholars for relying too heavily on the conclusions of Aristotle and other ancient thinkers. Instead of reasoning from abstract theories, he used scientists to experiment and then draw conclusions. This approach is called empiricism. Let's go with that. Or the experimental method, which is much easier to say, empiricism. Yeah, that's got to be it. Now, in France, René Descartes, he also took a keen interest in science. He developed an analytical geometry which linked algebra and geometry together. This provided an important new tool for scientific research. Like Bacon, Descartes believed that scientists needed to reject old assumptions and teachings. As a mathematician, he approached gaining knowledge differently than Bacon did. Rather than using experimentation, Descartes relied on mathematics and logic. He believed that everything should be doubted until proved by reason. The only thing he knew for certain was that he existed, because as he wrote, "I think, therefore I am." From this starting point, he followed a train of strict reasoning to arrive at other basic truths. Now, Western modern scientific theories are based on the ideas of both Bacon and Descartes. Scientists have shown that observation and experimentation, together with general laws, can be expressed mathematically and can lead people to a better understanding of the natural world around them. By the mid-1600s, the accomplishments of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo had shattered the old views of astronomy and physics. Later, the English scientist Isaac Newton helped to bring together their breakthroughs under a single theory of motion. Newton studied mathematics and physics at Cambridge University. By the time that he was 26, Newton was certain that all physical objects were affected equally by the same forces. Newton's great discovery was that the same force ruled motion of the planets and all matter on Earth and in space. The key idea that linked motion in the heavens with motion on Earth was the law of universal gravitation. According to this law, every object in the universe attracts every other object. The degree of attraction depends on the masses of the objects and the distance between those objects. In 1687, Newton published his ideas in a work called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. It was one of the most important scientific books ever written. The universe he described was like a giant clock. Its parts all worked together perfectly in ways that could be expressed mathematically. Newton believed that God was the creator of this orderly universe and the clockmaker who had set everything in motion. As astronomers explored the secrets of the universe, other scientists began to study the secrets of nature on Earth. Careful observation and the use of the scientific method eventually became important in many different fields. Scientists developed new tools and instruments to make the precise observations that the scientific method demanded. For example, the first microscope was invented by a Dutch maker of eyeglasses. His name was Zacharias Johnson in 1590. And then in the 1670s, a Dutch drapery merchant and amateur scientist named Anton van Leeuwenhoek used a microscope to observe bacteria swimming in tooth scrapings. Later, he's going to examine red blood cells for the first time through a microscope. In 1643, one of Galileo's students, Evangelista Tracelli, developed the first mercury barometer, which is a tool for measuring atmospheric pressure and predicting the weather. In 1714, the German physicist Gabriel Fahrenheit made the first thermometer to use mercury in glass. Fahrenheit's thermometer showed water freezing at 32 degrees, while a Swedish astronomer named Anders Celsius created another scale for the mercury thermometer in 1742. Now, Celsius scale showed freezing at 0 degrees. During the Middle Ages, European doctors had accepted as fact the writings of an ancient Greek physician named Galen. Galen had never dissected the body of a human being, and yet European doctors thought that what his research was basically fact. Instead, Galen studied the astronomy of pigs and other small mammals. Galen assumed that human astronomy was much the same as these animals, and he's not completely wrong. Although a Flemish physician named Andries Valesius proved Galen's assumptions wrong. Now, I assume it's Valesius. Sorry if I'm butchering people's names and you're like, I'm a scientist and I know what these are. I apologize. So Valesius, he dissected human corpses and published his observations. In his book on the structure of the human body, he talked about the details of the human organs, bones, and muscles, and it even came with detailed drawings of all of those things. In the late 1700s, British physician Edward Jenner introduced a vaccine to prevent smallpox. Now, this isn't necessarily new because inoculation, like using live smallpox germs, had been practiced in Asia for literally centuries. And while that's beneficial, this technique could also be dangerous because you could acquire smallpox and then you could actually die from it instead of just being inoculated. So Jenner, what he discovered is that you can inoculate with germs from similar diseases. So in this particular instance, there was a cattle disease called cowpox, and he used cowpox to give basically permanent protection from smallpox for humans. Because cowpox was a much milder disease, the risks for this form of inoculation were much lower. So essentially what Jenner did is he used cowpox to produce one of Europe's very first vaccinations. Okay, and that's it for the scientific revolution. If you have any questions or anything, make sure to email me, or you can text me, or you can call me, any of those three things. If you have any concerns about anything, make sure to reach out to me as soon as you can. You will have a content quiz like you do every single week, unless you have a response paper, which I believe our first response paper is next week. It might be the week after. I can't really remember. I'm not looking at my syllabus right now. But anyways, next week we are going to be talking about the Enlightenment. We're going to talk about the origins, the philosophies, gender and race in the Enlightenment, and we're going to discuss whether or not it's still relevant. So make sure that you not only have listened to this lecture, but you read the article that I assigned you. And yeah, if you have any questions, just holler at me. Otherwise, I'll see you all next week. Have a great one.